Maggie Sullivan never thought buying her first home would feel like stepping into a battlefield. It was supposed to be a fresh start, a quiet little house tucked behind rows of maple trees, in a neighborhood where folks waved from their driveways and kids rode their bikes until dinner. Maggie had spent years saving every penny from her job at the local bakery, dreaming of the day she could call a place her own. So when she finally found the house, a modest two-bedroom with a wraparound porch and a lilac bush in the yard, it felt like fate. She could already see herself planting sunflowers along the fence, waving at neighbors from her rocking chair, starting a life. But life had other plans. The HOA, a stern little committee with tight smiles and tighter rules, had called her the day after her offer went in. "We regret to inform you," the voice had said, polite but cold, "that your application has been denied. No reason given. Just no." Maggie sat on the floor of her apartment that night, staring at the email, her heart cracking open. How could they? She wasn't rich, sure, but she was responsible, hard-working. She wanted to belong here. As the sun dipped behind the hills and the streetlights flickered on, Maggie realized something. This wasn't just about a house. It was about being told she wasn't enough. And she wasn't going to take it lying down. Let us know in the comments where you're watching from, and if you've ever faced a situation where someone tried to shut you out for no good reason. Maggie's story is just getting started. The next morning, Maggie pulled into the HOA office parking lot, heart pounding so hard she could feel it in her fingertips. The building was squat and nondescript, almost blending into the row of businesses beside it: dentist, insurance agent, tanning salon. Nothing about it warned you of the small tyrannies that brewed inside. She clutched the thin manila folder she'd brought, stuffed with her paperwork. Bank statements, references, a letter from her employer. All the proof she thought she'd need to show she was a good, steady fit for the neighborhood. Inside, the front desk woman barely looked up when Maggie approached, just slid a stack of papers toward her with a fake smile and said, "They'll be in touch." But Maggie wasn't leaving it at that. She asked to speak with someone, anyone, who could explain why her application had been denied. After a long, awkward pause, a man in a blue golf shirt, Greg, his name tag read, appeared from a side door. He listened to Maggie's trembling voice, nodding along with kind of detached patience that only made her feel smaller. Then he smiled like he was delivering good news and said, "Well, the board just didn't feel you were the right fit for the community. We prioritize certain lifestyle alignments, you understand." Maggie blinked at him, trying to process the words. Lifestyle alignments? She wasn't a criminal. She wasn't irresponsible. She baked muffins for crying out loud. She tried one more time. "Is there something wrong with my application?" Greg's smile never faltered. "It's not personal," he said, ushering her toward the door with a hand on her back. "It's just policy." As Maggie stepped out into blinding sunlight, the door clicking shut behind her, she realized the truth. This wasn't about her paperwork. It was about her. Maggie sat in her car for a long time after that, hands trembling against the steering wheel. It wasn't just rejection. It was humiliation. They hadn't even bothered to pretend it was about her finances or her background. Lifestyle alignment. What did that even mean? She thought about the handful of times she had driven to the neighborhood. The matching lawns, the SUVs lined up like parade floats, the identical wreaths on the identical doors. She had loved it because it felt peaceful, safe. Now it just felt cold. Maggie wiped at her cheeks, furious with herself for crying. She had done everything right, and still it wasn't enough. She couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't about the paperwork at all. Maybe it was her second-hand car, still bearing the faded sticker from her old community college, or the plain gold band on her finger that didn't scream money. Maybe they'd taken one look at her and decided she didn't belong. Her stomach twisted at the thought. She could already hear the whispers she'd never be able to prove, the silent judgments, the little glances. She started the engine, blinking back fresh tears. At the red light, she picked up her phone and texted her husband, Caleb. "Can we talk?" Less than a minute later, 3 dots appeared on the screen, followed by, "Of course." "Where are you?" Maggie swallowed hard. Caleb had a way of making things right, but this felt bigger than anything he could fix. She debated whether to tell him at all. He worked in real estate. He'd spent years dealing with HOAs, and she hated the idea of adding to his stress. But then she remembered Greg's smile. That soft, fake smile that said you're not welcome here. Maggie tightened her grip on the wheel. No, she wasn't going to hide. Not this time. Caleb met her at their favorite diner, the one that smelled like bacon grease and coffee, and had cracks in the vinyl booths that nobody bothered to fix. Maggie slid into the seat across from him, feeling the weight of everything pressing against her ribs. For a moment she just stared at him, his familiar face, his calm, steady hands wrapped around a chipped coffee cup. Home, without a word. He reached across the table and laced his fingers through hers. "Tell me everything," he said softly. So she did, every detail. Every awful moment inside that HOA office. Every word Greg had said. Every feeling that crawled under her skin and made her feel like she didn't belong. Caleb listened without interrupting, his jaw tightening with each new piece. When she finished, he leaned back, shaking his head slowly. "Mags, they played you." She nodded, biting her lip to keep it from trembling. Caleb was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, in that low, certain way that always made her feel like everything would be okay, "They don't get to do this." Maggie tried to smile, but it wobbled. "What can we do? It's not like we can make them sell me the house." Caleb's mouth tugged into a grim smile. "Maybe not, but I know they're kind. They think they're untouchable because they hide behind policies and meetings and bylaws." His eyes sharpened the way they did when he was closing a deal. "They forgot something important, though. You're married to a property dealer, and I know how to hit them where it hurts." Maggie blinked at him, her heart thudding. She wasn't sure what he meant. But for the first time since that awful meeting, a flicker of hope sparked to life. Caleb squeezed her hand, his voice low and sure. "We're not done yet." 2 days later, Maggie sat quietly beside Caleb as he guided their car back into that manicured neighborhood, the one that tried to shut her out like she was something unclean. Caleb had spent the past 48 hours making calls, digging through property records, connecting dots Maggie didn't even know existed. And now he was ready. The HOA meeting was being held in the community clubhouse, a low-slung brick building with fake shutters and a big brass eagle mounted above the door. Maggie's stomach twisted into knots as they walked in, every set of eyes swiveling toward them, conversations dropping to hushed murmurs. At the front of the room sat the board, Greg and a few others, their faces a mixture of polite curiosity and thinly disguised irritation. Caleb didn't hesitate. He marched straight up to the sign-in table, smiled wide, and said, "Caleb Sullivan, representing an interested party." Maggie wanted to melt into the floor, but Caleb's confidence was unshakable. He handed over a crisp manila envelope with a casual flick of the wrist. Greg opened it, and his smug expression crumpled like wet paper. Inside were purchase offers. Several of them. Caleb had quietly contacted half the owners in the neighborhood, and a surprising number were ready to sell. People looking to downsize, to move closer to grandkids, or just plain tired of HOA nonsense. Caleb had spent years building relationships, knowing who needed to move and when. He leaned in and said it so only Greg could hear. "If you don't reconsider my wife's application, I'll help the right buyers turn this place into something you don't recognize anymore." Greg's throat bobbed as he swallowed. Hard. Maggie watched, stunned, as the board members glanced around, murmuring, their little empire wobbling on its axis. Caleb straightened, calm as ever. "Your move," he said. The meeting broke into chaos almost immediately. Greg whispered urgently to the other board members, who huddled like startled crows, throwing nervous glances at Caleb and Maggie. A few residents, ones who hadn't been clued in on the board's games, leaned over to whisper among themselves. Sensing something was unraveling, Maggie sat frozen in her chair, feeling like she'd stumbled into someone else's life. She had never seen a room turn so quickly, from smug certainty to barely disguised panic. One of the board members, a woman with tightly curled hair and a clipboard pressed her chest, finally stood up and cleared her throat. "We need a moment," she announced, voice brittle. The board filed into a back room, the door swinging shut with a hollow thud that echoed in the sudden silence. Maggie turned to Caleb, her voice a thin whisper. "What did you actually offer them?" He smiled slightly, that slow, dangerous smile she'd seen only a handful of times, the one that came out when someone tried to cheat him. "Options they can't afford to ignore," he said. "I know this neighborhood's debt load. I know their bylaws inside and out. If even a few houses go to buyers who don't fit their lifestyle alignment nonsense, their little kingdom falls apart." Maggie stared at him, wonder and love and fierce pride all tangling inside her chest. This man, the same man who once spent an entire Saturday fixing a wobbly kitchen chair because he couldn't stand things being almost right, had gone to battle for her without a second thought. Across the room, residents stirred restlessly, exchanging nervous glances. People were starting to realize this wasn't just about one woman's application. It was about power, about control, about what kind of place they wanted to live in. Maggie squeezed Caleb's hand under the table. Whatever happened next, they were ready. When the board finally slunk back into the room, the air had changed. The tight confidence they'd worn like armor was gone, replaced by something smaller, meaner. Greg cleared his throat, shifting papers that didn't need shifting, buying time. "After careful review," he said stiffly, "we've decided to reconsider the application submitted by Mrs. Sullivan." Maggie blinked. She had prepared herself for a fight, a public showdown. She hadn't expected them to fold, at least not this easily. Caleb stayed silent, just leaning back in his chair, arms crossed, letting the silence stretch long and uncomfortable. Greg floundered, clearly waiting for some kind of gratitude, some acknowledgement. When none came, he forced a brittle smile. Of course, final approval would still be contingent upon a few additional conditions. The words hung in the air like smoke. Maggie felt her stomach tighten again. She knew that tone, knew it from every time in her life when someone tried to dress up exclusion in polite language. Caleb's face didn't even flicker. "What kind of conditions?" he asked, voice perfectly even. Greg shuffled his papers again, avoiding eye contact. "Simple stuff. Minor appearance upgrades. Lawn maintenance plans. Additional oversight to ensure compatibility with neighborhood aesthetics." Maggie's hands curled into fists under the table. They weren't folding, they were setting a trap, trying to make it so suffocating she'd give up on her own. Across the room, a few residents exchanged uneasy glances. Not everyone was buying it anymore. Maggie felt their eyes on her, the silent question, "Will you bend for them, or will you stand?" She turned to Caleb, who gave her the smallest of nods. Her heart hammered in her chest, but when she spoke, her voice was steady. "I'll agree to reasonable standards, the same ones everyone else follows. Nothing more, nothing less." A murmur rippled through the room. The line was drawn. Greg's face twitched just a flicker, but Maggie caught it. He wasn't used to being challenged like that, especially not by someone he thought he could steamroll. For a moment, the entire room seemed to hold its breath, waiting for him to push harder. But Caleb leaned forward slightly, elbows resting on the table, wearing a patient, lethal kind of smile, the smile of a man who knew exactly how much leverage he held. Greg cleared his throat again, his voice tight. "Of course, Mrs. Sullivan. We expect the same from all residents." The lie sat heavy in the air. Maggie didn't call him on it. She didn't need to. Everyone in that room knew the truth now. The meeting ended shortly after. No fanfare, no congratulations. Just paperwork slid across the table with shaking hands. Signatures exchanged like cold coins. As they stepped outside into the evening air, Maggie finally let out the breath she'd been holding. The sky was fading into that soft purple that comes just before dark, and the first few porch lights flickered to life along the street. She turned to Caleb, feeling like she was standing on unfamiliar ground. "We did it," she whispered, almost afraid to believe it. He reached out and tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear, his hand lingering against her cheek. "You did it, Mags," he said, voice rough with pride. "I just made sure they couldn't ignore you." Across the street, a few neighbors watched from their doorsteps, some curious, some wary. Maggie met their eyes calmly, lifting her chin. She didn't need their approval. Not anymore. She had fought for this place, for the right to belong without bending herself into something smaller, something more acceptable. She squeezed Caleb's hand tight. Whatever came next, they would face it together. The days that followed were strange, quiet, but heavy with things unsaid. Some neighbors crossed the street to introduce themselves, wearing cautious smiles that spoke of second chances. Others kept their distance, offering tight nods or lingering stares that Maggie refused to shrink under. She spent the first Saturday morning planting sunflowers along the fence, the one she dreamed about for so long. Caleb worked beside her, sleeves rolled up, his hands steady and sure. Every time she drove past Clubhouse, she caught glimpses of hurried meetings. Greg and the board, red-faced and tense, trying to stitch their little empire back together. Word had gotten around that the new girl hadn't just gotten in. She'd stood up to them, and won. Maggie didn't flaunt it. She didn't need to. It lived in the way she carried herself now, the way she looked people in the eye when they spoke to her, not with anger, but with a quiet certainty. I belong here, whether you like it or not. One evening, as she was watering her new garden, a woman from 2 houses down approached, her hands fidgeting with the strap of her purse. Maggie straightened, bracing for whatever was coming. But the woman only smiled, a little awkward but genuine. "I heard what happened," she said, glancing over her shoulder like she was sharing a secret. Took guts to stand up to them. Most of us just put up with it. Maggie didn't know what to say. She wasn't used to being called brave. She wasn't sure she believed it. But the woman's smile widened. "I'm glad you're here." Then she turned and walked away, her words hanging in the cool evening air. Maggie stood there for a long time after, hose forgotten in her hand, the water pooling around her boots. Maybe she hadn't just found a house after all. Maybe she was building something bigger. A month later, Maggie sat on her porch swing, a glass of lemonade sweating in her hand, watching the neighborhood settle into summer. Kids zipped by on bikes. The hum of sprinklers filled the air, and for the first time since she laid eyes on the street, she felt something soft and steady settle in her chest. Home. The lilacs she had worried over so carefully were in full bloom now, their scent drifting lazily on the breeze. Across the street, the neighbor who had once refused to meet her eyes now waved from his driveway. Maggie lifted her hand and waved back, easy, natural, like it had always been that way. Caleb stepped outside, 2 mugs of coffee balanced in one hand, and dropped into the seat beside her with a groan. "I think the lawn officially hates me," he said, mock mournful. Maggie laughed, the sound light and real. "It's character building," she teased. For a long moment they just sat there, sipping their drinks, listening to the world spin quietly around them. It would never be perfect, this neighborhood, this life, but maybe that was the point. Perfection was just a mask anyway. Real things, real homes, real belonging, came with cracks and scars and battles fought in small rooms behind closed doors. Maggie leaned her head against Caleb's shoulder, the wood of the swing creaking gently beneath them. She thought about the girl she'd been just a few months ago, the one who thought she had to earn her place by being small and agreeable and aligned. That girl would be proud. Tired, maybe, bruised around the edges, but proud. As the sun dipped behind the maples and the porch light flickered on, Maggie closed her eyes and breathed it all in. This was her home now. Hard won. Fully hers. And no one could take it from her again.